stupid, beady-eyed and nut-brained. Reptiles with wings. Pigeon heads. Turkeys. They fly into windows, peck at their reflections, buzz into power lines, blunder into extinction. Our language reflects our disrespect. Something worthless or unappealing is for the birds. An ineffectual politician is a lame duck. To lay an egg is to flub a performance. To be henpecked is to be harassed with persistent nagging. Eating crow is eating humble pie. The expression bird brain, for a stupid, foolish, or scatterbrained person, entered the English language in the early 1920s because people thought of birds as mere flying, pecking automatons, with brains so small they had no capacity for thought at all. That view is a gone goose. In the past 2 decades or so, from fields and laboratories around the world have flowed examples of bird species capable of mental feats comparable to those found in primates. There's a kind of bird that creates colorful designs out of berries, bits of glass, and blossoms to attract females, and another kind that hides up to 33,000 seeds scattered over dozens of square miles and remembers where it put them months later. There's a species that solves a classic puzzle at nearly the same pace as a 5-year-old child, and one that's an expert at picking locks. There are birds that can count and do simple math, make their own tools, move to the beat of music, comprehend basic principles of physics, remember the past, and plan for the future. In the past, other animals have gotten all the publicity for their near-human cleverness. Chimps make stick spears to hunt smaller primates, and dolphins communicate in a complex system of whistles and clicks. Great apes console one another, and elephants mourn the loss of their own. Now birds have joined the party. A flood of new research has overturned the old views, and people are finally starting to accept that birds are far more intelligent than we ever imagined, in some ways closer to our primate relatives than to their reptilian ones. Beginning in the 1980s, the charming and cunning African gray parrot named Alex partnered with scientist Irene Pepperberg to show the world that some birds appear to have intellectual abilities rivaling those of primates. Before Alex died suddenly at the age of 31, he had mastered a vocabulary of hundreds of English labels for objects, colors, and shapes. He understood the categories of same and different in number, color, and shape. He could look at a tray holding an array of objects of various colors and materials and say how many there were of a certain type. "How many green keys?" Pepperberg would ask, displaying several green and orange keys and corks. 8 out of 10 times, Alex got it right. He could use numbers to answer questions about addition. Among his greatest triumphs, says Pepperberg, were his knowledge of abstract concepts, including a zero-like concept, his capacity to figure out the meaning of a number label from its position in the number line, and his ability to sound out words the way a child does, NUT. Until Alex, we thought we were alone in our use of words, or almost alone. Alex could not only comprehend words, he could use them to talk back with cogency, intelligence, and perhaps even feeling. His final words to Pepperberg as she put him back in his cage the night before he died were his daily refrain, "You be good, see you tomorrow. I love you." Pacific, of crows that fashion their own tools in the wild and appear to transmit local styles of toolmaking from one generation to the next, a feat reminiscent of human culture and proof that sophisticated tool skills do not require a primate brain. When scientists presented these crows with puzzles to test their problem-solving abilities, the birds astonished them with their crafty solutions. In 2002, Alex Kaselnik and his colleagues at Oxford University asked a captive New Caledonian crow named Betty, "Can you get the food that's out of reach in a little bucket at the bottom of this tube?" Betty blew away the experimenters by spontaneously bending a piece of wire into a hook tool to pull up the little bucket. Among the published studies tumbling from scientific journals are some with titles that lift the brows. Have we met before? Pigeons recognize familiar human faces, the syntax of gargles in the chickadee, language discrimination by Java. Sparrows, chicks like consonant music, personality differences explain leadership in barnacle geese, and pigeons on par with primates in numerical competence. Bird brain, the slur came from the belief that birds had brains so diminutive they had to be devoted only to instinctual behavior. The avian brain had no cortex like ours, where all the smart stuff happens. Birds had minimal noggins for good reason, we thought, to allow for airborne ways, to defy gravity, to hover, arabesque, dive, soar for days on end, migrate thousands of miles, and maneuver in tight spaces. For their mastery of air, it seemed, birds paid a heavy cognitive penalty. A closer look has taught us otherwise. Birds do indeed have brains very different from our own, and no wonder. Humans and birds have been evolving independently for a very long time, since our last common ancestor more than 300 million years ago. But some birds, in fact, have relatively large brains for their body size, just as we do. Moreover, when it comes to brain power, size seems to matter less than the number of neurons, where they're located, and how they're connected. And some bird brains, it turns out, pack very high numbers of neurons where it counts, with densities akin to those found in primates, and links and connections much like ours. This may go a long way toward explaining why certain birds have such sophisticated cognitive abilities. Like our brains, the brains of birds are lateralized, they have sides that process different kinds of information. They also have the ability to replace old brain cells with new ones just when they're needed most. And although avian brains are organized in an entirely different way from our brains, they share similar genes and neural circuits, and are capable of feats of quite extraordinary mental power. To wit, magpies can recognize their own image in a mirror, a grasp of self once thought limited to humans, great apes, elephants, and dolphins, and linked to highly developed social understanding. Western scrub jays use Machiavellian tactics to hide their food caches from other jays, but only if they've stolen food themselves. These birds seem to have a rudimentary ability to know what other birds are thinking and, perhaps, to grasp their perspective. They can also remember what kind of food they buried in a particular place, and when, so they can retrieve the morsel before it spoils. This ability to remember the what, where, and when of an event, called episodic memory, suggests to some scientists the possibility that these jays may be able to travel back into the past in their own minds, a key component of the kind of mental time travel once vaunted as uniquely human. News has arrived that songbirds learn their songs the way we learn languages and pass these tunes along in rich cultural traditions that began tens of millions of years ago, when our primate ancestors were still scuttling about on all fours. Some birds are born Euclideans, capable of using geometric clues and landmarks to orient themselves in three-dimensional space, navigate through unknown territory, and locate hidden treasures. Others are born accountants. In 2015, researchers found that newborn chicks spatially map numbers from left to right, as most humans do. This suggests that birds share with us a left-to-right orientation system, a cognitive strategy that underlies our human capacity for higher mathematics. Baby birds can also understand proportion and can learn to choose a target from an array of objects on the basis of its ordinal position. They can do simple arithmetic, as well, such as addition and subtraction. Bird brains may be little, but it's plain they punch well above their weight. Birds have never seemed dumb to me. In fact, few other creatures appear so alert, so alive in fiber and faculty, so endowed with perpetual oomph. Sure, I've heard the story of the raven attempting to crack open a ping-pong ball, presumably to get at an egg-like morsel within. A friend of mine, while vacationing in Switzerland, watched a peacock try to fan its broad tail during a mistral. It toppled over, stood upright again, fanned again, and tipped over again, 6 or 7 times in a row. Each spring the robins nesting in our cherry tree attacked the side mirror of our car as if it were a rival, pecking furiously at their own reflections while streaking the door with guano. But who among us hasn't been toppled by our own vanity or made an enemy of our own image? I've watched birds most of my life and have always admired their pluck and focus and the taut, quick vitality that seems almost too much for their tiny bodies to contain. As Lewis Halley once wrote, a man would be worn out in short order by such intensity of living. The common species I saw around my old neighborhood appeared to negotiate the world with brisk curiosity and aplomb. The American crows striding around our garbage cans with a prince's proprietary air looked like highly resourceful creatures. I once watched a crow stack 2 crackers in the middle of a road before flying off to a safe spot to devour his collected booty. One year, an eastern screech owl roosted in a box on a maple tree just a few yards from my kitchen window. In the daylight hours, the owl slept, only its round head showing, perfectly framed in the round hole facing the window. But at night, the owl was gone from the box, off hunting in the night. As the dawn light rose, there were signs of his brilliant success, the wing of a mourning dove or songbird hanging from the hole of the box, twitching, before it was yanked inside. Even the red knots I encountered on the beaches of Delaware Bay, not the mentally swiftest of birds, seemed to know where to be, and when, to catch the rich feast of eggs laid by horseshoe crabs each full moon in spring. What calendar of sky drew these birds northward and told them where to go? I learned about birds from a pair of bills. The first was my father, Bill Gorham, who began taking me birdwatching near our home in Washington, D.C., when I was 7 or 8. It was the Beltway version of a Swedish cicada, the act of rising early to appreciate nature, and it was one of the palpable joys of my childhood. On early weekend mornings in spring we left the house in the dark and headed to the woods along the Potomac River to catch the dawn chorus, that mysterious moment when birds sing with 1,000 voices in a music numerous as space, but neighboring as noon, as Emily Dickinson wrote. My father learned about birds as a Boy Scout from a nearly blind man named Apollo Talaporos. The old man relied on his ears alone to pick up species. Parula warbler. Yellow-rumped warbler. Towhee. The birds are there, he would call out to the boys. Go find them. My father got very good at identifying birds by their calls, the melodious flute-like song of the wood thrush, the soft witchetty of a common yellowthroat, or the clear whistling call of a white-throated sparrow. As my father and I wandered through the woods in late starlight, I would listen to the husky song of a Carolina wren and wonder what, if anything, those birds were saying, and how they learned their songs. Once, I encountered a young white-crowned sparrow apparently engaged in song practice. There he was, perched invisibly somewhere in a low branch of a cedar tree, softly running through his whistles and trills, getting them wrong, and then going back over them quietly and persistently until he delivered the final run of his kind. This sparrow, I later learned, gleans his songs not from his own father but from birds in his natal environment, that very neighborhood of woods and rivers where my father and I rambled, a place with its own dialect passed down through the generations. The other Bill I met at the Sussex Bird Club when I lived in Lewes, Delaware. Bill Freck was up and out of the house every morning at 5 a.m. for 4 or 5 hours of watching shorebirds and those little brown jobs, or LBJs, common in the woods and fields around Lewes. A patient, devoted, and inexhaustible observer, he kept meticulous notes on what birds he saw, where, and when, which ended up at the Delmarva Ornithological Society as part of the state's official bird records. This Bill was nearly deaf, but he was a wizard at identifying birds visually, by their so-called GISS, their general impression, size, and shape. He showed me how to spot a goldfinch high on the wing by its dipping flight and how to tell shorebirds apart by noting their personality, behavior, and gestalt, just as one recognizes friends from a distance by their overall manner and gait. He taught me the difference between casual birdwatching and the more intense, focused birding, and urged me to go beyond identifying birds to noting their actions and behavior. The birds I observed on those excursions and others seemed to know what they were doing. Like the black-billed cuckoo a friend saw perched just above a nest of tent caterpillars, the cuckoo waited as the caterpillars climbed out of the nest to scale the tree, then plucked them off one at a time, like sushi from a conveyor belt. Still, I never imagined that the magpies and jays, the chickadees and herons, I admired so much for their feathers and flight, their songs and calls, might have mental abilities that match, even exceed, those in my primate tribe. How can creatures with a nut-sized brain perform such sophisticated mental feats? What has shaped their intelligence? Is it the same or different from ours? What, if anything, do their little brains have to tell us about our big ones? Intelligence is a slippery concept, even in our own species, tricky to define and tricky to measure. One psychologist describes it as the capacity to learn or to profit by experience. And another, as the capacity to acquire capacity, the same sort of circular definition offered up by Harvard psychologist Edwin Boring: intelligence is what is measured by intelligence tests. As Robert Sternberg, a former dean at Tufts University, once quipped, there seem to be almost as many definitions of intelligence as experts asked to define it. In judging the overall intelligence of animals, scientists may look at how successful they are at surviving and reproducing in many different environments. By this measure, birds trump nearly all vertebrates, including fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. They are the one form of wildlife visible nearly everywhere. They live in every part of the globe, from the equator to the poles, from the lowest deserts to the highest peaks, in virtually every habitat, on land, sea, and in bodies of freshwater. In biological terms, they have a very big ecological niche. As a class, birds have been around for more than 100 million years. They are one of nature's great success stories, inventing new strategies for survival, their own distinctive brands of ingenuity that, in some respects at least, seem to far outpace our own. Somewhere in the mists of deep time lived the yearbird, the common ancestor of all birds, from hummingbird to heron. Now there are some 10,400 different bird species. More than double the number of mammal species, thick-knees and lapwings, kakapos and kites, hornbills and shoebills, chakars and chachalakas. In the late 1990s, when scientists estimated the total number of wild birds on the planet, they came up with 200 to 400 billion individual birds. That's roughly 30 to 60 live birds per person. To say that humans are more successful or advanced really depends on how you define those terms. After all, evolution isn't about advancement, it's about survival. It's about learning to solve the problems of your environment, something birds have done surpassingly well for a long, long time. Which to my mind makes it all the more surprising that many of us, even those of us who love them, have found it hard to swallow the idea that birds may be bright in ways we can't imagine. Perhaps it's because they're so unlike people that it's difficult for us to fully appreciate their mental capabilities. Birds are dinosaurs, descended from the lucky, flexible few that survived whatever cataclysm did in their cousins. We are mammals, related to the timid, diminutive shrew-like creatures that emerged from the dinosaurs' shadows only after most of those beasts died off. While our mammal relatives were busy growing, birds, by the same process of natural selection, were busy shrinking. While we were learning to stand up and walk on 2 feet, they were perfecting lightness and flight. While our neurons were sorting themselves into cortical layers to generate complex behavior, birds were devising another neural architecture altogether, different from mammals but, in some ways, at least, equally sophisticated. They, like us, were figuring out how the world works, and all the while, evolution was fine-tuning and sculpting their brains, giving their minds the magnificent powers they have today. Birds learn. They solve new problems and invent novel solutions to old ones. They make and use tools. They count. They copy behaviors from one another. They remember where they put things. Even when their mental powers don't quite match or mirror our own complex thinking, they often contain the seeds of it. Insight, for instance, one of our big-ticket cognitive abilities, which has been defined as the sudden emergence of a complete solution without trial-and-error learning. It often involves mental simulation of a problem and a kind of aha moment when the solution becomes apparent in a flash of understanding. Whether birds have actual insight remains to be determined, but certain species seem to understand cause and effect, one of the building blocks of insight. The same is true for theory of mind, a nuanced understanding of what another individual knows or thinks. Whether birds possess this full-blown ability is debatable, but members of certain species seem to be able to take the perspective of another bird or sense its needs, necessary components of theory of mind. Some scientists call these building blocks or stepping stones the signatures of cognition and believe they may be the precursors to such highly complex human cognitive abilities as reasoning and planning, empathy, insight, and metacognition, awareness of one's own thought processes. Of course, these are all human yardsticks of intelligence. We can't help but measure other minds against our own. But birds also possess ways of knowing beyond our ken, which we can't easily dismiss as merely instinctual or hardwired. What kind of intelligence allows a bird to anticipate the arrival of a distant storm? Or find its way to a place it has never been before, though it may be thousands of miles away? Or precisely imitate the complex songs of hundreds of other species? Or hide tens of thousands of seeds over hundreds of square miles and remember where it put them 6 months later? Maybe genius is a better word. The term comes from the same root as gene, derived from the Latin word for attendant spirit present from one's birth, innate ability or inclination. Later, genius came to mean natural ability, and finally to denote exceptional talent, natural or learned. More recently, genius has been defined as nothing more nor less than doing well what anyone can do badly. It's a mental skill that's exceptional compared with others, either of your kind or another kind. Pigeons have a genius for navigation that far, far exceeds our own. Mockingbirds and thrashers can learn and remember hundreds more songs than most of their fellow songbird species. Scrub jays and nutcrackers have memories for where they put things that make our capacity look meager. In this book, genius is defined as the knack for knowing what you're doing, for catching on to your surroundings, making sense of things, and figuring out how to solve your problems. In other words, it's a flair for meeting environmental and social challenges with acumen and flexibility, which many birds seem to possess in abundance. Often this involves doing something innovative, something new, taking advantage of a new food source, for instance, or learning how to exploit it. The classic example of this was demonstrated years ago by tits in the United Kingdom. Both great tits and blue tits picked up the knack of opening the cardboard caps of milk bottles delivered to people's doorsteps in the morning to get at the rich cream on top. Birds can't digest the carbohydrates in milk, only the lipids. The tits first learned the trick in 1921 in the town of Swaithling. By 1949, the behavior had been noted in hundreds of localities throughout England, Wales, and Ireland. The technique had apparently spread by one bird copying another, an impressive show of social learning. The misguided use of bird brain as a slur has finally come home to roost. One by one, the bellwether differences between birds and our closest primate relatives seem to be falling away: toolmaking, culture, reasoning, the ability to remember the past and think about the future, to adopt another's perspective, to learn from one another. Many of our cherished forms of intellect, whether in whole or parts, appear to have evolved in birds quite separately and artfully right alongside our own. How can this be? How can creatures separated by a 300 million year gulf of evolution have similar cognitive strategies, skills, and abilities? For one thing, we share more biology with birds than one might think. Nature is a master of bricolage, hanging on to biological bits that are useful and modifying them for new purposes. Many of the changes that separate us from other creatures have arisen not through the evolution of new genes or cells but through subtle shifts in how existing ones are used. This shared biology is what makes it possible to use other organisms as model systems to understand our own brains and behavior, to study learning in the giant sea snail Aplysia, anxiety in zebrafish, obsessive-compulsive disorder in border collies. We also share with birds similar ways of meeting nature's challenges, which we've arrived at through very different evolutionary paths. It's called convergent evolution, and it's rampant in the natural world. The convergent shape of wings in birds, bats, and the reptiles known as pterosaurs results from the problems posed by flight. To meet the challenges of filter feeding, creatures as far apart on the tree of life as baleen whales and flamingos show striking parallels in behavior, body form, even body orientation during feeding. As evolutionary biologist John Endler points out, again and again, in totally unrelated groups, we find many instances of convergence in form, appearance, anatomy. That both humans and certain species of birds have evolved brains large for their body size almost certainly represents convergent evolution. Likewise, the evolution of the same patterns of brain activity during sleep. And similarly, the evolution of analogous brain circuits and processes for learning song and speech. Darwin called birdsong the nearest analogy to language. He was right. The parallels are eerie. Especially when you consider the evolutionary distance between humans and birds. A group of 200 scientists from 80 different labs recently offered a window on these parallels when they sequenced the genomes of 48 birds. Their results, published in 2014, revealed startlingly similar gene activity in the brains of humans learning to speak and birds learning to sing, suggesting that there may be a kind of core pattern of gene expression for learning shared by birds and humans alike and arrived at through convergent evolution. For all these reasons, birds are turning out to be wonderful animal models for understanding how our brains learn and remember, how we create language, what mental processes might underlie our problem solving, and how we locate ourselves in space and in social groupings. The circuits in the bird brain that control social behavior are much like the circuits in our own brains, it turns out, run by similar genes and chemicals. By investigating the neurochemistry of a bird's social nature, we stand to learn something about our own. Likewise, if we can grasp what's going on in a bird's brain as it masters a melody, we might get a better handle on how our own brains learn language, why it gets harder to master a new language over time, and maybe even how speech evolved in the first place. If we can understand why two animals so distantly related converged on the same pattern of brain activity during sleep, we might solve one of nature's great mysteries, the purpose of sleep. This book is a quest to understand the different sorts of genius that have made birds so successful and how they came about. It's a journey of sorts, venturing as far afield as Barbados and Borneo, as near as my own backyard. It's also a voyage into the brains of birds, right down to the cells and molecules that drive their thinking and, sometimes, ours. Each chapter tells the story of birds with extraordinary abilities or skills, technical, social, musical, artistic, spatial, inventive, adaptive. A few are exotic species, others, more common. You'll see members of the supremely clever corvid and parrot families appear and reappear throughout these pages, but also the sparrow and the finch, the pigeon and the chickadee. I'm interested in the everyman of the bird world as well as the Einsteins. I might have chosen other species as my stars, but I chose these for a simple reason: they have great stories to tell, stories that illuminate what might be going on in the mind of a bird as it solves the problems around it, and also, perhaps, give us some perspective on what is going on in our own minds. All these birds stretch our thinking about what it means to be intelligent. The final chapter focuses on the adaptive brilliance of certain birds. Only a relative few possess this genius. Changes in the environment, especially those induced by humans, throw a wrench into the lives of many birds and disrupt their keen ways of knowing. A recent report from Audubon tells us that half of the bird species in North America, from whippoorwill to white-tailed kite, common loon to shoveler, piping plover to dusky grouse, are likely to go extinct in the next half-century or so for one reason: because they can't adapt to the rapid pace of human-induced change on our planet. Which birds will survive and why? In what ways are we humans an evolutionary force selecting for a certain kind of bird and bird intelligence? Scientists are coming at these puzzles from many different angles. Some are lifting the hood on the bird brain. using modern techniques to see what's going on in a bird's neural circuits when it recognizes a human face, or to listen to individual brain cells as a songbird learns its song, or to compare the neurochemicals in birds that are social butterflies with those that are loners. Some are sequencing and comparing bird genomes to pinpoint genes involved in complex behaviors such as learning. Others are strapping tiny geolocator backpacks on the backs of migratory birds to probe their journeys and their mapping minds. They're watching, tagging, measuring, conducting tireless observations, carefully preparing experiments at great length, some of which ultimately fail and must be reconfigured because their subjects are too wary or ornery. In short, these scientists are exploring the brains and behavior of birds in extraordinary, difficult, even heroic ways. But in this book, the birds themselves are the heroes of their own stories. My hope is that by the time you finish these pages, the chickadee and the crow, the mockingbird and the sparrow, will look a little different to you. More like the bright fellow sojourners they are, enterprising, inventive, cunning, playful, shrewd individuals that sing to one another in accents, make complex navigational decisions without asking for directions, remember where they put things using landmarks and geometry, steal money, steal food, and understand the mental state of another individual. Clearly, there's more than one way to wire a clever brain. From dodo to crow. Taking the measure of a bird mind. The woods are cool, dark, and mostly quiet except for the occasional bird call from somewhere in the thick canopy above, a patchwork of emerald, lichen, avocado, and a dark, coppery, almost iridescent green. This is typical mountainous rainforest on the island of New Caledonia, a remote tropical finger of land in the southwest Pacific, halfway between Australia and Fiji. The Parc de Grandes Fougères is named for the giant tree ferns that grow to 7 stories and give this forest a truly primeval feel. The trail I'm following climbs for a while, then dips down toward a stream, where the birdsongs and calls grow louder. I have come to this island to see what is arguably the world's smartest bird, the New Caledonian crow, a member of the common but uncommonly intelligent corvid family. It's a bird species made famous by Betty, that crow who some years ago appeared to spontaneously bend a piece of wire into a hook to fetch some hard-to-get food. And more recently by a wizard of a bird nicknamed 007, who became a star in 2014 when his speedy solution to a challenging 8-step puzzle was captured on film by the BBC. The puzzle was created by Alex Taylor, a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. It consisted of 8 separate stages, each made of various special chambers and toolboxes containing sticks and stones, all laid out on a tabletop. The bird 007 had seen the different parts of the puzzle but never in this particular configuration. To win the cube of meat in the final special food chamber, he had to work out the puzzle's steps in the proper order. In the video, a dark, handsome bird flies into view, settles on a perch, and takes a few moments to scope out the situation. Then he flutters up to a branch that holds a stick hanging from a string, the first step in the puzzle. He pulls up the stick, one string length at a time, until he can grasp the stick with his beak. He drops down from perch to tabletop, hops over to the food chamber, and uses the stick to poke into the food chamber's deep horizontal hole to try to collect the treat. But the stick is too short, so he uses it instead to retrieve 3 stones from 3 separate boxes. These he drops one at a time into a hole at the top of a chamber containing a longer stick balanced on a seesaw. The weight of the 3 stones tilts the seesaw inside the box, releasing the long stick, which the bird takes back to the food chamber to lever out his meat. It's an astonishing process, and it takes the bird all of 2.5 minutes to complete. The really clever part is this: the 8-stage puzzle requires understanding that a tool can be used not just to get at food directly but to get at another tool that will help access the food. Spontaneously aiming a tool at an object that's not food but deemed useful to secure another tool, known as metatool use, has been seen only in humans and great apes. It suggests that the crows have an abstract understanding of what a tool does, says Taylor. The task also demands working memory, the ability to keep in mind facts or thoughts and manipulate them for a short time, a few seconds or so, while solving a problem. Working memory is what allows us to remember what we're looking for when we scan a bookshelf for a particular title or recall a phone number while we pull out a piece of paper to write it down. It's a vital component of intelligence, which this crow seems to possess in spades. From somewhere along the stream, I catch the whack of one New Caledonian crow, maybe two calling to each other, not unlike the caw of an American crow, only played in reverse. Birds are so often encountered this way, as disembodied voices. The low, mournful woo, woo, woo in the distance might be the little green foghorn of a cloven-feathered dove, an exotic harlequin of a bird with bands of white and dark green across its wings and rump. But the canopy here is so thick I can't make out any birds at all. The sun passes behind a cloud and the forest darkens. Suddenly, from the understory, I hear a weird sibilant hiss. I peer into the glade. The hiss moves closer. Then out of the green gloom I see a large pale bird running toward me like a spirit loosened from the ground, a hybrid of bird and ghost. It's heron-like, knee-high, with a cockatoo crest, but smoky gray, the flightless kogu, sole representative of its family and among the 100 rarest birds on Earth. I had been looking for a supremely clever bird, common in these parts. And here I had stumbled on a most uncommon bird, one that appeared to be, well, a few crayons short of the box. The kogu is near extinction, its population numbers in the hundreds. And no wonder, I thought. A bird that runs toward a possible predator? In a way, the kogu seems a bookend to the crow, a delegate of the dim end of the intelligence spectrum. How could this creature be in the same phylogenetic class as the cunning crows? Both birds occupy the same remote island. Are New Caledonian crows evolutionary anomalies, hyper-intelligent deviants that have advanced far beyond their feathered peers? Or are they simply at the high end of the bird genius continuum? By the same token, is the kogu really such a dodo? Clearly, all birds are not equally bright or able in all ways, at least by current accounting. Pigeons, for instance, don't do well on tasks that require them to abstract a general rule to solve a suite of similar problems, a skill easily learned by crows. But the lowly pigeon is a wizard in other ways. It can remember hundreds of different objects for long periods of time, discriminate between different painting styles, and figure out where it's going even when displaced from familiar territory by hundreds of miles. Shorebirds such as plovers, sanderlings, and sandpipers show no evidence of insight learning, that grasp of relationships that permits birds like the New Caledonian crow to use tools or to operate man-made devices that reward their ingenuity with food. But one shorebird, the piping plover, is a master of theatrics, capable of diverting predators from their shallow, exposed nests with a feigned injured wing display. What makes one bird smarter than another? How do you measure a bird's intelligence anyway? To explore these questions, I traveled to a spot half a world away from New Caledonia, the Caribbean island of Barbados, where more than a decade ago Louis Lefebvre invented the first scale of intelligence for birds. A biologist and comparative psychologist at McGill University, Lefebvre has spent his career inquiring into the nature of the bird mind and how to take its measure. One winter not long ago, I went to see him and his birds at the Bellairs Research Institute, a hodgepodge of 4 small buildings near Hull Town on the west coast of Barbados, where he conducts his studies. The institute is a small estate that was bequeathed to McGill in 1954 by Commander Carleon Bellairs, a British naval officer and politician, for use as a marine research station. These days, few researchers use the place except Lefebvre and his team. It was February, the middle of the dry season in Barbados, but monsoon-like downpours passed through frequently, drenching the Institute's courtyard and forming pools of water in the dips and depressions of the terrace at Seabourn, the residential building hard by the Caribbean Sea, where 60-something, with an easy smile and a shock of curly grayish-black hair, Lefebvre trained under the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. He first studied grooming in animals, an innate, programmed behavior. Now he aims to understand the more complex behavior of birds, how they think, learn, and innovate, using the weedy bird species in his own Bajan backyard. Unlike New Caledonia, Barbados is not a spot to goose your life list. Measured against the lush diversity found in most tropics, the island disappoints. It's marked by a distinctly depauperate avifauna, as the experts say, home to only 30 native breeding species and 7 introduced species. This is partly due to its physical nature. A tiny, low stack of young coral limestone east of the main chain of Lesser Antillean islands, Barbados is too flat for rainforest and too porous for creeks and marshes. Moreover, in the past few centuries, the island's natural fields, forests, and scrubland have been planted over with sugarcane. These days Barbados is heavily developed with towns and facilities for tourism. From the open windows of the painted buses shuttling back and forth between hotels and beaches come calypso tunes. Flourishing here are the few bird species that advance rather than recede in the face of this human expansion. For a birder set on spotting rare species such as the kogu, Barbados is a wasteland. But if you're keen on watching birds do smart, beguiling things, it's a paradise. The tameness of the birds here makes it easy to do experiments, says Lefebvre. The wide stone terrace right in front of his apartment, for instance, is a sort of casual lab where Zenaida doves, the pigeons of Barbados, and Carib grackles mull around, waiting for action. The grackles are glossy black with a bright yellow eye, smaller than the American boat-tailed variety and more compact. They know that Lefebvre is the pellet and water guy, as he says, and are pacing about the terrace like impatient clergymen, waiting for him to deliver. He empties a pan of water on the terrace, creating a little lake, and throws out some tough pellets of dog food on the dry portion. The grackles seize a pellet in their bills and strut over to the puddle, ceremoniously and delicately dip the pellet in the water, then flap off to eat the softened food. More than 25 species of birds dunk food in the wild for one reason or another. To wash soiled or toxic items, to soften hard or dry ones, or to smooth the fur or feather of hard-to-swallow prey. It's prototool behavior, a kind of food processing, Lefebvre explains. The dunking makes the pellet easier to eat. Once I pre-soaked the pellets, and they stopped dunking. They walked over to the puddle, but didn't actually dunk. So they know what they're doing. In Carib grackles, dunking is a relatively rare behavior because it's risky. Our studies show that 80 to 90% of these grackles are capable of the behavior, but they'll only do it if the circumstances are right, says Lefebvre, the quality of food, the social conditions, who's around to compete or steal. The longer food handling time increases the risk of theft from other grackles that scrounge or pilfer. Theft is a major cost of dunking, he explains. Up to 15% of items are stolen by competitors. There's a cost-benefit ratio, and the birds are smart enough to determine whether it's worth it. That seems like intelligent behavior by any measure. Animal scientists tend to shy away from the term intelligence because of the human connotations it carries, Lefebvre tells me. In his History of Animals, Aristotle wrote that animals carry elements of our human qualities and attitudes, such as fierceness, mildness or cross-temper, courage or timidity, fear or confidence, high spirits or low cunning, and with regard to intelligence, something akin to sagacity. These days, however, suggest that a bird has anything like human intelligence. Anthropomorphizing, interpreting the behavior of a bird as if it were a human clothed in feathers. It's a natural human impulse to project our own experience on the nature of other creatures, but this can, and does, lead us astray. Birds, like humans, are kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, subphylum Vertebrata. There the common descent ends. Birds are class Aves, we are Mammalia. And in that branching is a mountain of biological difference. But wouldn't it be a mistake to assume that because birds and their brains are fundamentally different from us and ours, there is nothing in common between our mental abilities and theirs? We call our species Homo sapiens, the sapient, to distinguish us from the rest of life. However, in The Descent of Man, Darwin argued that animals and humans differ in their mental powers only in degree, not in kind. For Darwin, even earthworms show some degree of intelligence in their manner of dragging pine needles and vegetable matter to plug up their burrows, protection from the proverbial early bird. Tempting as it may be to interpret the behavior of other animals in terms of human mental processes, it's perhaps even more tempting to reject the possibility of kinship. It's what primatologist Franz de Waal calls anthropogenial blindness to the human-like characteristics of other species. Those who are in anthropogenial, says de Waal, try to build a brick wall to separate humans from the rest of the animal kingdom. In any case, says Lefebvre, you have to watch your vocabulary. He points to a study published recently on empathy in mice and one on mental time travel in birds, which raised both eyebrows and doubts. I'm not questioning the experiments, they are sound, and they do not anthropomorphize, he says. But perhaps we go too far in the words we use to describe what we think is going on. Like Lefebvre, most scientists who study birds prefer the term cognition to intelligence. Animal cognition is generally defined as any mechanism by which an animal acquires, processes, stores, and uses information. It usually refers to the mechanisms involved in learning, memory, perception, and decision-making. There are so-called higher and lower forms of cognition. For instance, insight, reasoning, and planning are considered high-level cognitive abilities. Lower-level cognitive skills include attention and motivation. There's less consensus about what form cognition takes in a bird's mind. Some scientists suggest that birds possess distinct types of cognition, spatial, social, technical, and vocal, that don't necessarily dovetail. A bird can be smart spatially without being gifted in social problem solving. In this view, the brain is seen as a bundle of different specialized processors, or modules, discrete zones adapted and dedicated to a particular purpose, like the circuitry for learning birdsong or for navigating through space. The information in each module is essentially unavailable to other modules. Lefebvre, on the other hand, argues for such a thing as general cognition, one all-purpose processor, untidily distributed, for problem-solving in different domains, pointing out that if a bird ranks high on one cognitive measure, it tends to rank high on others. When an animal is solving problems, he says, different zones in the brain are likely involved in a network of interactions. According to Lefebvre, some scientists in the modular camp are beginning to inch toward his view as studies uncover evidence that some birds may be using general cognitive mechanisms to solve different sorts of problems. For instance, he says, social intelligence in some birds appears to go hand in hand with spatial memory or episodic-like memory, the ability to remember what happened where and when. There's a parallel discussion in human intelligence. Most psychologists and intelligences, Harvard psychologist Howard Gardner identifies 8 different types of intelligence and suggests that they're independent. They are bodily, linguistic, musical, mathematical or logical, naturalistic, spatial, interpersonal, and intrapersonal, a list with intriguing parallels in the bird world. Think of a hummingbird's acrobatic use of its own body, or a plain-tailed wren's astonishing talent for musical duets, or a pigeon's gift for knowing where it needs to go. Other scientists argue for such a thing as general intelligence in humans, being all-around smart, a G factor, as it's known. A group of 52 researchers who assembled to tackle the matter some years ago agreed, intelligence is a very general capability that, among other things, involves the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly and learn from experience. If defining intelligence in birds is problematic, measuring it is perhaps even harder. The truth is, the development of a battery of tests to measure bird cognition is still in its infancy, says Lefebvre. There's no standard IQ test for birds. So scientists try to devise puzzles for birds that reveal their cognitive abilities, comparing the performance between species and also between individuals of the same species. A nondescript little brown Bajan bird plays a key role in Lefebvre's recent investigations. While I sit writing up notes on the back porch of Lefebvre's apartment overlooking an azure sea, the little brown birds flit about in the branches of Australian casuarinas and mahogany trees nearby. Then they pop right onto the terrace railings. I stare at one perched within arm's reach. He flips around, cocks his head, and stares back at me. Why the keen interest? He seems to ask. Because you're notorious around here for your clever, thieving ways, and for your discovery of a new food source. Loxodila barbadensis, these bullfinches are the house sparrows of Barbados, says Lefebvre. Before there were screens installed in the building to protect against dengue fever, the bullfinches would fly through his apartment windows or doors open to the sea air to ravage bananas on the kitchen counter or make off with chunks of bread or cake. But their claim to fame is their discovery of a new food source in the outdoor restaurants lining the Caribbean Sea. Later, Lefebvre shows me the bird's special food trick. In a narrow alley between two shorefront clubs in Holetown is a stone wall edging a Palladian-style mansion by the sea. Lefebvre places a packet of sugar on a rock and then lines up 4 more along the wall. It takes only seconds for a bullfinch to find the treasure. It lands on the wall and investigates the little white paper square, flips it over, apparently inspecting for holes, then carries it up to a nearby tree branch. In 30 seconds it has poked through the paper and is feeding on the sugar, white crystals coating its little bill like milk around a child's mouth. It's a unique talent, not mastered by the handful of other weedy species that make this island their home. This bullfinch knows what it's doing. It's bold, brazen, and quick to explore new sources of food. It was here in the land of the bullfinch that Lefebvre devised a scale of intelligence based on the idea that smart birds innovate. Like the bullfinch and those cream-skimming tits, they do new things. Birds with lesser brains are set in their ways and rarely invent, explore, or dip into the novel. As it happens, the Bajan bullfinch has a dimmer doppelganger on the island, the closely related black-faced grassquit, which provides an intriguing comparison. The two birds are alike in nearly every respect, save one. On the spectrum of intelligence, the bullfinch is a quick study. In comparison, its sister species is slow and plodding. The contrast between these two backyard species has offered Lefebvre a window on the nature of the bird mind. These two birds are virtual genetic twins with the same ancestor, having diverged probably only a couple of million years ago, Lefebvre explains. Both live in the same environment. Both are territorial and share the same social system. The only difference is that the bullfinch is clever, fearless, and opportunistic, and the grassquit, skittish, deeply conservative, and afraid of nearly everything. The evolutionary backstory of the bullfinch may be telling. When it arrived on Barbados, the species diverged from the colorful Lesser Antillean bullfinch. In that species, males and females are dimorphic in color, with females a plain brown and males sporting a sexually selected plumage of handsome black with a bright red throat. Here in Barbados, the bullfinches are monomorphic, both genders an equally humble brown. One explanation for this evolutionary shift is that Barbados didn't have the carotenoid-based foods that allowed the birds to produce reds and yellow for plumage, says Lefebvre. But as it turns out, the bird's red plumage doesn't require carotenoids. It's possible that females are selecting for something other than plumage. Maybe they're going for males that seek innovative food sources, like sugar packets. In other words, maybe female bullfinches on Barbados like their males on the smart side. I don't know of any other pair of closely related species that are so similar and yet so different in their opportunism and foraging strategies, says Lefebvre. In a small expanse of woods and fields at Folkestone Marine Park, he offers an informal experiment to demonstrate his point. Several grassquits are visible, poking about in the grass 30 yards away, foraging on seed. A few other birds are off in the trees at some distance. Lefebvre throws out a handful of birdseed, then squats in the grass. The grackles are the first to notice. Within half a minute, they're gathering around in a noisy flock. Their squawks draw doves, more grackles, and squadrons of bullfinches. The grassquits have not budged. They just keep their heads down, closely attending only to their little plots of grass. Lefebvre lowers his voice to a whisper and says in a British accent, a perfect result, as if staged, with David Attenborough hiding in the wings. And in an uncanny imitation of the famous naturalist, this bird does amazing things. He stands up abruptly and points at the grassquits. Zero opportunism there, he says. They're attracted neither by the seed nor by the birds feeding on it. They're just not on the lookout for alternative food sources. For 15 years Lefebvre ignored grassquits because they seemed so boring. But now they present a perfect experimental pairing with the bullfinch because of their genetic closeness. Why is the grassquit the way it is, wonders Lefebvre. It has the same ancestral genotype as the bullfinch, lives in the same environment. What makes it take such a totally different approach to food? Why is one bird so much bolder, smarter, and more opportunistic than the other? Studies show that species that differ in feeding ecology also differ in learning ability. And in the brain structure underlying learning, says Lefebvre. So first up is an experiment presenting both birds with tasks to measure their basic cognitive abilities. It's a step toward linking the natural behavior the scientists see in the field with differences they can measure in the laboratory. Traps for bullfinches, but in 25 years of work here, he has never caught a grassquit in such a trap. The birds are far too wary. So the team uses mist nets to capture their subjects. Then the trick is to find something the grassquits will do, says Lefebvre. They're so skittish that if an experimental apparatus is a little too weird, they just don't participate. In the field, one of Lefebvre's graduate students, Lima Coelho, has measured the speed at which the two species will feed from an open cup of seed. The bullfinches find the novel food source in about 5 seconds, she says. It takes the grassquits 5 days. A yogurt top filled with seeds is just too odd for them, says Coelho. For the cognitive experiments, Coelho presents each of the two species with something they've never seen, a small transparent cylinder of food with a removable lid. She measures how long it takes the birds to approach the apparatus, make contact with it, and then flip the lid and feed on the seed. There's variety of performance, even among the bullfinches. One bullfinch flits around the aviary for several minutes, then hangs bat-like from the lowest perch for several more minutes, before finally venturing toward the apparatus and opening it. It takes him a total of 8 minutes to solve the task. A second bird goes straight to the new gizmo and opens it almost immediately. Good boy, says Coelho. Time spent on trial, 7 seconds. Of the 30 bullfinches Coelho tested, 24 quickly completed the obstacle removal task. Not one of the 15 grassquits even got close to the cylinder. Some bullfinches, like that second one, seem able to figure out how to solve the problem quickly, with very few attempts. Is this an example of insight? Lefebvre doesn't think so. In a comparable study, his graduate student Sarah Overington examined every peck of grackle made in a similar problem-solving test. After scrutinizing hundreds of hours of videos, Overington observed that the birds had 2 types of pecks. The first type of peck was an attempt to get directly at the food, the second type was to the side, which made the lid move, giving the bird a cue to keep going with the pecking. Even a little visual or tactile feedback can direct the bird. If it was insight, says Lefebvre, you would expect a sudden solution to the problem, a kind of eureka. This is more like trial and error learning, a lesser cognitive ability. The point is, behaviors that seem extraordinary or intelligent may arise out of simple or reflexive processes. One striking example of this is cluster flocking, birds or other creatures moving in apparent unison, sometimes in large numbers. I was once drawn to my yard by a cacophony of starlings beating our hackberry tree with black, twittering blossoms. Suddenly the shadow of a hawk passed over, and the blackbirds exploded upward, almost as one, and swirled away. I watched the whole shimmering sheet of them dark against the sky, wheeling, twisting, eddying in intricate movements with the cohesion of a single organism, an effective strategy for deterring a predator like a hawk or a falcon. The great naturalist Edmund Selous, who loved birds passionately and observed them with scientific fervor, attributed this flocking phenomenon to telepathic thought transference from one bird to the next. They circle, now dense like a polished roof, now disseminated like the meshes of some vast all-heaven-sweeping net, now darkening, now flashing out a million rays of light. A madness in the sky, he wrote. They must think collectively, all at the same time, or at least in streaks or patches, a square yard or so of an idea, a flash out of so many brains. We've since learned that the spectacular collective behavior of flocking birds is self-organized, emerging from simple rules of interaction among individuals. Birds are not transfusing thought, communicating telepathically with their flock members to act in unison, as Selous surmised. Instead, each bird is interacting with up to 7 close neighbors, making individual movement decisions based on maintaining velocity and distance from fellow flock members and copying how sharply a neighbor turns, so that a group of, say, 400 birds can veer in another direction in a little over half a second. What emerges is almost instantaneous ripples of movement in what appears to be one living curtain of bird. It's a common assumption that apparently complex behavior must arise from complex thought processes. But the quick problem-solving abilities of the bullfinches and grackles in these basic cognition tests probably have more to do with paying attention to visual feedback and self-correcting along the way than instantly figuring out a solution. In another test of cognition, Kaelo tries to get the birds to unlearn what they've learned and relearn something new. She presents each bird with 2 cups, one yellow, one green, filled with edible seed, and lets the bird pick one to eat from to find out its color preference. She then replaces the edible seed in that colored cup with an inedible seed that is glued to the bottom of the cup. She measures how long it takes for each bird to switch over from the cup with its preferred color to the other, non-preferred colored cup. When that's done, she again switches the colors that identify the edible and inedible seeds. This technique, called reversal learning, is often used as a basic measure of how rapidly a bird can switch its thinking and learn a new pattern. It's an indicator of flexible thinking, Lefebvre explains. For humans as well as birds. People with mental deficits or Alzheimer's disease are often tested with reversal learning tasks to check their flexibility of thinking. There's no question, the bullfinches are quick studies. Most get the hang of the switching after only a few trials. The grassquits, on the other hand, take their time. They're slow, wary. But eventually they master the trick and end up making fewer wrong color choices than the bullfinches. Surprising, says Lefebvre, but reassuring in a way, at least we found one test that grassquits do well. If one of the species you're using in your experiment fails every test you give it, the problem may be you, the researcher, not the animal. You may have failed to understand what is relevant to the way a bird sees the world. This is one way scientists attempt to measure a bird's intelligence, by testing its speed and success at solving problems in the laboratory. They try to design challenges similar to those a bird might encounter in its natural environment, say, the ability to remove obstacles, or to navigate around barriers to find hidden foods. They ask birds to open food containers by pushing levers, pulling strings, swinging caps aside. They measure how long it takes and how readily birds change tactics in attempting to solve the problem. They test for insight by trying to determine whether a bird's discovery of a solution is a sudden flash of understanding or gradual and more reflexive. It's tricky, however. In these kinds of lab tests, all sorts of variables may affect a bird's failure or success. The boldness or fear of an individual bird may affect its problem-solving performance. Birds that are faster at solving tasks may not be smarter, they may just be less hesitant to engage in a new task. So a test designed to measure cognitive ability may really be measuring fearlessness. Is the grassquit just a shyer bird? Unfortunately, it is extremely difficult to get a pure measure of cognitive performance that is not affected by myriad other factors, says Neeltje Boogert, a former student of Lefebvre, now a bird cognition researcher at the University of St. Andrews. Birds, just like humans, will differ in how motivated they are to solve a cognitive test, how stressed they are about the test situation, how distracted they are by their surroundings, and how much experience they have had with similar tests. A raging debate is ongoing in the field of behavioral ecology on how we should go about testing animal cognition. Thus far, no clear solutions have emerged. Some years ago, Lefebvre was struck by the possibility for another sort of measure, one that would gauge a bird's cognitive ability not in the laboratory but in the wild. The idea was sparked by chance during a walk on the beach in Barbados. It was right after a violent storm, he says. I was crossing the beach near the Hole, the lagoon in Hole Town that overflows into the sea after heavy rains, and I noticed that several hundred guppies had gotten trapped in small ponds on a sandbar. As the stranded fish flipped from one pool to the next, Lefebvre saw gray kingbirds swoop down to pick off the fish, take them back to a tree, and hammer them against a branch before eating them. Gray kingbirds are a kind of common West Indian flycatcher. They're well known for catching insects on the wing, but not fish. This was the first known observation of the birds applying their usual hunting skills to an entirely unusual prey. Lefebvre wondered, why was the kingbird the one bird taking advantage of this splendid new food source? Was it an especially intelligent or innovative species, like the tits that cracked the coat of milk bottle caps to get at the cream? Maybe a good way to measure bird cognition, Lefebvre thought, would be to look at these sorts of occurrences, birds doing unusual new things in the wild. It's a notion that was proposed 3 decades ago by Jane Goodall and her colleague Hans Kummer. The pair made a plea for measuring a wild animal's intelligence by looking at its ability to find solutions to problems in its natural setting. What's needed is an ecological rather than a laboratory measure of intelligence, they suggested. This can be found in an animal's ability to innovate in its own environment, to find a solution to a novel problem, or a novel solution to an old one. Lefebvre published his observation on the gray kingbirds in the notes section of the Wilson Bulletin, which issues reports of uncommon bird behavior by amateur birdwatchers and professionals alike. It occurred to him that collecting these sorts of anecdotal notes from ornithological journals might provide just the sort of ecological evidence Kummer and Goodall called for. Which kinds of birds are the most innovative in the wild? Experimental and observational studies of cognition are important, says Lefebvre, but a taxonomic count like this would provide a unique opportunity and would avoid some of the pitfalls of animal intelligence studies, for instance. The use of testing devices that are far removed from what an animal does in its natural environment. Lefebvre scoured 75 years' worth of bird journals for reports featuring keywords like unusual, novel, or first reported instance, and came up with more than 2,300 examples from hundreds of different species. Some of these were daring discoveries of strange new foods, a roadrunner sitting on a roof next to a hummingbird feeder and picking off the hummers, a great skua in the Antarctic snuggling in among newborn seal pups and sipping milk from their lactating mother. Herons wolfing down a rabbit or a muskrat, a pelican in London swallowing a pigeon, a gull ingesting a blue jay, or a normally insectivorous yellowhead in New Zealand seen for the first time eating bush lily fruits. Other examples involved ingenious new ways of getting at food. There was the cowbird in South Africa using a twig to pick through cow dung. Several observers noted instances of green-backed herons using insects as bait, placing them delicately on the surface of the water to lure fish. A herring gull adapted its normal shell-dropping technique to nail a rabbit. Among the more inventive examples, bald eagles. Ice fishing in northern Arizona. The birds had discovered a cache of dead fathead minnows frozen under the surface of an ice-covered lake. They were seen chipping holes in the ice, then jumping up and down on the surface, using their body weight to push the minnows up through the holes. One of Lefebvre's favorites was the report of vultures in Zimbabwe that perched on barbed wire fences near minefields during the War of Liberation, waiting for gazelles and other grazers to wander in and detonate the explosives. It gave the birds a ready-made meal already pulverized. However, says Lefebvre, occasionally a vulture got caught at its own game and was exploded by a mine. Once the anecdotes were gathered, Lefebvre grouped them by bird family and calculated the innovation rates for each family. He also corrected his analyses to account for possible confounding variables, especially research effort. Some species are simply more often observed, so they're more likely to be seen doing novel things. Honestly, initially I didn't think it would work, he says. Anecdotes are considered unscientific, they're weak data, in the lingo. If one anecdote is unscientific, how can 2,000 anecdotes become science? But I accepted the data at face value. If there was SLU in the database, it was probably randomly distributed across taxonomic groups, so it wouldn't affect the results. I've been waiting for something to come up that would invalidate the system, but nothing has. What are the smartest birds according to Lefebvre's scale? Corvids, no surprise, with ravens and crows as the clear outliers, along with parrots. Then came grackles, raptors, woodpeckers, hornbills, gulls, kingfishers, roadrunners, and herons. Also high on the totem pole were birds in the sparrow and tit families. Among those at the low end were quails, ostriches, bustards, turkeys, and nightjars. Lefebvre then took his scale a step further. Did families of birds that showed a lot of innovative behaviors in the wild have bigger brains? In most cases, there was a correlation. Consider two birds weighing 320 grams, the American crow, with an innovation count of 16, has a brain of 7 grams, while a partridge, with one innovation, has a brain of only 1. 9 grams or two smaller birds weighing 85 grams, the great spotted woodpecker, with an innovation rate of 9, has a brain weighing 2.7 grams, and the quail, with one innovation, only 0.73 gram. When Lefebvre presented his findings at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2005, the press picked up on the study, calling it the world's first comprehensive avian IQ index. Lefebvre found the IQ idea a little cheap, he said. But why not? The notion caught on, and Lefebvre ended up being quizzed closely by interested journalists. When one asked him to name the world's dumbest bird, Lefebvre answered, that would be the emu. The next day's headlines read, Canadian researcher names national bird of Australia world's most stupid bird. The emu and the kangaroo were selected as unofficial emblems of Australia to symbolize the forward movement of a nation, reflecting a common, and false, belief that neither animal can easily move backward. This did not make Lefebvre popular in Australia. But his position was buoyed when he appeared on an Australian radio show and one caller related a story of being in the outback with Aboriginals, who told him that if he lay down on his back and raised his foot, the emus would come to investigate, thinking he was one of them. Lefebvre acknowledges that the size of a bird's brain or even the size of key parts of it is a relatively crude measure of intelligence. After all, the little stint, a sandpiper, has a relatively large brain for its body size, he says, and all it does is skitter back and forth with the waves, pecking at invertebrates. We've known for a long time that a big brain is not necessarily a proxy for smarts. A cow has a brain 100 times the size of a mouse's, but it isn't any smarter. And animals with minute brains have surprising mental abilities. Honeybees, with a brain weighing 1 milligram, can navigate landscapes on par with mammals, and fruit flies can learn socially from other fruit flies. the ratio of brain size to body size, called brain encephalization, seems to play into the picture, although how closely encephalization correlates with intelligence is still a matter of debate. It's not just about size, at least not in all animals, says Lefebvre. When we're measuring brain volume, are we measuring information processing capacity? Asks Lefebvre. Probably not. A bird's ability to innovate is now accepted as a measure of cognition by many scientists. But if brain size doesn't control a bird's tendency to innovate, what does? What distinguishes innovators from non-innovators? Is there a difference between the same-size brains of the bright bullfinch and the apparently duller grassquit? The problem is to get inside an animal's head, says Lefebvre. Until now, the focus has all been on brain volume, whole, or of particular parts. But that's not really where it's happening. What's controlling innovation and cognitive ability is not size, but what's going on at the level of the neuron.